Welcome to all those joining us today, both our audience and our panelists, for what I'm sure will be a really interesting and informative discussion on the growing problem of online hate. This is the first time that the Board of Deputies has hosted a fringe event at the Conservative Party conference, and it's delightful to be here. And of course, as with all our party conferences this year, it's taking place online. Our ability to communicate online has many advantages. In the current global pandemic, for example, it has allowed us to communicate far more easily with friends, families, and colleagues, but it has also had some serious issues which need to be resolved before they get even worse. In 2019, a record year in terms of anti-Semitism in the UK, figures from the CST showed that incidents of online anti-Semitism made up 39% of the total, up from 25% the year before. In the first 6 months of 2020, it made up 44% of the total. Many of us have either experienced online hate themselves or have friends or a relative who has been targeted. More often than not, a complaint made to the social media company in question receives the response, this post has not breached our community guidelines. The Board of Deputies experienced this very response earlier this year when we reported a bomb threat to us. The social media platform in question later acknowledged its mistake, but incidents like this are far too frequent. This all leads me to one conclusion. Online is the new frontline in the fight against anti-Semitism. And not just anti-Semitism, but misogyny, anti-Muslim hatred, homophobia, racism and bigotry against other religions, ethnicities, and minority groups. We must all work together to stamp it out. As many of you may be aware, the government is currently looking at bringing forward its online harms bill, with a government response expected in the coming weeks before a bill comes before Parliament in the new year. We believe there are a number of tools we can bring to the fight against online hate, and we have been in discussion with the government with the 3 key steps which we believe need to be taken. First, with regard to anti-Semitism in particular, one of the issues we have seen time and time again is that social media companies quibble over what constitutes anti-Semitism, with those using loose language in their respective community standards. In recent years, we have had this problem in political parties, on university campuses, and with local councils. Part of the solution in these and other cases has been the adoption of the agreed definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA definition. I need not remind this audience that it was a Conservative Party government in 2016 that led the world in the first country to adopt the IHRA definition, and successive Conservative community secretaries have pushed this forward in local authorities and on university campuses. And I want to reiterate my thanks here to Robert Jenrick, who has been such a stalwart on this issue. Thank you. But similarly, we think that the social media companies should be required to adopt the full IHRA definition as part of their community guidelines. This could happen by the new regulator for social media adopting it as the standard by which they will judge whether social media companies are discharging their obligations around the safety of Jewish users. Secondly, and this is more generic to racism and prejudice in its various forms, we would recommend that social media companies be required to have a minimum number of staff involved in enforcement in the UK to deal with complaints involving UK users. We think that a UK team will have a better grasp of the political, cultural, and linguistic issues specific to the UK, which may be driving prejudice than would someone from another country with a different culture or even with a different dialect of English, where slang or offensive terms may differ. We also believe that compelling companies to have monitoring teams in the UK would make it easier for government and for civil society to hold social media companies to account. Thirdly, it has unfortunately become clear over recent years that social media companies will ultimately only act when it affects their bottom line. This is why we have come to the conclusion that to get real change, the government should follow the German model of introducing heavy fines for social media companies who fail to enforce the agreed standards sufficiently strongly or swiftly, possibly including personal liability for senior executives. The Conservative Party has taken an admirably strong stance on anti-Semitism over recent years, for which we are all immensely grateful. Now we ask the government to take the same muscular approach online as it has offline and make the internet a better place for us all in society. To discuss this and other points, I will now hand over to our Chief Executive, Gillian Merron, to introduce our panellists and initiate what I know will be a fascinating conversation. So thank you. Gillian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marie, and welcome to everybody who's joined us today. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce a very wonderful panel who I know are going to really bring some very important points to us for today's discussion. So firstly, I want to introduce Victoria Atkins. Victoria is the MP for Louth and Horncastle. She's the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Safeguarding. And prior to entering Parliament, Victoria worked as a barrister and was one of a very small number of advocates appointed to the Attorney General's list and also the Serious Fraud Officer's list of specialist fraud prosecutors. Welcome, Victoria. Our next panellist is the Right Honourable Rob Halfon, MP for Harlow. Rob is one of a number of Jewish Conservative MPs, and prior to becoming an MP, he worked as political director for Conservative Friends of Israel. He has chaired the House of Commons Education Select Committee since 2017. So welcome to you, Rob. Thank you for joining us. Our third panellist is Saqib Bhatti MP for Merron. Elected for the first time in 2019, he previously served as president of the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce, the youngest in its 200-year history, and was appointed and honoured with an MBE this year for services to diversity and inclusion in the business community. Welcome. And our final panellist today is Lord Popat. Well known to us as a long-term friend of the Jewish community, Lord Popat has also written about the great challenges that online hate and misinformation pose to society, writing in a Times of India article in July, and I quote, "The challenge of fake news and hate speech requires careful consideration and collaboration between government, academia, publishers, social media platforms, and civil rights groups. You are all very welcome here today." So I'm going to start by giving each of our panelists up to 4 minutes to tell us about their personal experience of online hate. And I'd like to start with Victoria. Victoria, perhaps you could talk to us, and particularly I know you'll want to tell us about why you felt the need to leave Twitter a couple of years ago.
Well, thank you so much, Gillian and Marie, and thank you to the Board of Deputies. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be with you all today, and welcome everybody across the country. I'm sitting, just in case you're wondering whether I have the Conservative logo as part of my home decor, I'm sitting in a very socially distanced CCHQ, and really pleased to be able to be with you today. And I'm really pleased that as part of your first fringe event here at Conservative Party Conference 2020, that you're grappling with the, I think, very, very important and very difficult issue of online hate. We all like the internet. There are good things about the internet. We've all enjoyed the freedoms and the knowledge that the internet has given us. But I think now 10 or 15 years in, we're also very, very aware of the ways in which the internet can be used for bad purposes. And it is very much with that in mind that I'm coming to you today as a Home Office Minister with responsibility for safeguarding, and who's one of the team of ministers working on the online harms paper, which I suspect we'll talk about in more detail. In terms of my own experiences, I'm a woman in public life, and any woman in public life, whether they're a member of parliament or a councillor or a journalist or on the television, I'm afraid we get our share of online abuse. I don't for a moment pretend that I've had the sorts of abuse that some of my colleagues have seen. I mean, if you are a woman and you are from an ethnic minority, then I fear you receive even more abuse than simply being a woman or of an ethnic minority. So there are many, many ways in which people can spread the hate on social media and on the internet. But you're quite right, Gillian. I mean, I don't want to really focus on the haters and the hate, but I took the decision a couple of years ago to come off Twitter because I was frankly fed up with the atmosphere on there. I have to say it's not a decision I've ever regretted. And I find, Westminster's pretty good at gossip. So if it's something that's really important to find out about, believe you me, I get to hear about it without the help of Twitter. But to me, it was just I just wanted to take control of my own presence on the internet and on social media, and I took that decision. Not everybody wants to do that. Not everybody agrees with that. That's absolutely fine. But I think we should all, we should very much feel empowered to do what we feel comfortable with and what we are happy to do. I'm really pleased, though, that I'm speaking to you now, as I say, as Safeguarding Minister, because rather than just complaining and acknowledging that there's a problem, this government wants to really do something about it. And we have said time and time again that we want the UK to be the safest place in the world to be online. And our work on the online harms white paper and the bill in due course is absolutely part of that programme of work. So I suspect we'll be talking about this a good deal more in this session. But for me, I think putting a duty of care on social media companies to make sure that they understand their responsibilities to their customers, but also to the wider internet community, I think that's absolutely key. All too often we hear the sorts of things that Gillian and Marie have talked about, the online assessment of community harms and how a person's complaint doesn't meet the community harms set by that company. And we want to really bring some consistency into how social media companies and other tech companies deal with these sorts of complaints. I'm really, really pleased, as I say, that we're working on that. We've also got a piece of work with the Law Commission, whereby the Law Commission is looking at online hate or hate crime more generally, offline as well as online. And I think that's a really important part of this debate. But I don't want to take up time. I'm delighted to see the other panelists that I have the pleasure of appearing with. So I just really, again, thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Victoria. And I'll now turn to Rob to invite you, Rob, to tell us about your experience of online hate.
Thank you very much, and it's really good to be here. Thank you to Gillian and particularly to Marie and the Board of Deputies for all the remarkable work they're doing to try and grapple with this issue. Someone asked me the other day, they said, how do you deal with all the anti-Semitic stuff that appears on Twitter? And I said to them, oh, it's water off a duck's back. I'm so used to it now, and you just tend to ignore it. And I thought about my answer to my friend's question and realized how wrong my answer was, because I actually was saying basically it's so commonplace I've become immune to it, and that shouldn't be happening. And clearly things have changed over the past few years. In a debate on anti-Semitism in the House of Commons in 2018, I said that the air was tightening. You feel hot, you want to do up your collar because of what is happening in terms of anti-Semitism, not just online hate, but also sadly offline. And I've had people shouting at me in the streets in my constituency to go back to Israel and stop being funded by the Mossad and Israeli intelligence services and the like. And that would never have happened a few years ago. But today we're talking specifically about online hate. And I just want to pose a few challenges about these issues. Clearly, public action is very important. And the boycott that was done by the Jewish community, I participated that against social media companies seemed to be effective. The only thing I would say about it is we have to be very careful, because every time you boycott a social media company, you give space for those who promote online hate, for those who are promoting the dark side of social media to proliferate, and it gives them even more space than otherwise they have. So I would use boycotts very, very sparingly and just to make a point. The other, clearly more moderation is needed by the social media companies, absolutely. However, I just also want to pose a couple of challenges on this. One, it's infinite. So however much moderation goes on, there are infinite people on Twitter, there are infinite people who want to express awful online hate, anti-Semitism, racism, whatever it may be. It is always going to be very difficult to deal with. They could have all the moderators in the world, but I don't think it might be cracked down on a bit, but I don't think it's going to stop it completely. The second thing I worry about is when we talk about moderation is that what happens if a social media company decides that it doesn't like the stance of the state of Israel, for example, and then starts moderating people who write comments in support of the state of Israel. Now, you may think that is far-fetched, but given what happens in terms of boycotts of Israel on campus and boycotts of Israel movements in our society, do not underestimate the power of those people who take a particular view on the state of Israel and the Jewish community to turn moderation to their advantage. And I think we have to be very, very careful with that. I think there are two ways that we can deal with this. Victoria, who's a brilliant Home Office minister, made a point that the government is strengthening the law. Clearly, obviously, we've got to get the social media companies to adopt the Holocaust definitions, absolutely. But what I never understand is if someone writes a racist thing about me in the newspaper or in a book, you are able to sue that individual or get them prosecuted for racial harassment. And yet, if it's done on Twitter, everyone seems to have a license to do whatever they choose to do. And I think the laws of racial abuse, the laws of defamatory behavior on social media should be massively strengthened so that the government treat them like as if they were being published in a book or in a newspaper. Having said that, of course, we don't get away with books completely, because diarists are now allowed to talk about the so-called Jewish lobby in Parliament with impunity, with the recent book that is that has just come out, which I won't name because I don't want to give it any further publicity. But nevertheless, there should be much, much stronger laws against defamatory and online behavior on social media. And in terms of registering, no anonymized accounts should be allowed unless their address is registered with the social media companies. When you log on to Amazon or whatever it may be, you have to put your address there, you have to put your details. The same things should apply to social media companies. And the final thing I want to say is that even with the laws that I've just put out, even with the welcome recognition, if social media companies would do it, of the Holocaust recognition guidelines, none of it will change unless we transform education in our country. And what we have to do, and I have been to, in my constituency, to an amazing classrooms run by Google, where they teach children about how to use the internet properly and how to deal with online hate and not. And I think it should be embedded in the national curriculum. Social media has become so all pervasive. It has had such an impact on children's lives, particularly in increasing, sadly, what I regard as a mental health epidemic amongst young people in our country. I think that dealing with social media, educating people to use social media properly, if we start it when children are very young, from primary school onwards, I think we can actually change behaviours. I think we're almost too late now to deal with the current generation because we've lived in a kind of libertarian free-for-all. So we can only strengthen the laws, but I think we can change things for future generations if we are very strong in terms of embedding social media in our education, in our curriculum. And I just think those would be a few suggestions that I would put forward, but we shouldn't be afraid to deal with it and confront it. And today's Fringe is incredibly important because it's highlighting a problem, carrying on putting public pressure on the social media companies to do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. That's really helpful. And I would say to you, as I would say to all of the panelists and anyone watching who suffers online abuse, that how sad and sorry that you have to go through that. And Victoria made the point about being somebody in public life, and it is an unacceptable side of public's life. I'm sure we would all agree on that. So thank you. And I'd now like to ask Saqib to introduce himself.
Thank you so much, Gillian. And can I thank the Board of Deputies for putting this event together and congratulate you on your inaugural Fringe event. I hope there are many more. And thank you for leading the charge on this really important issue. And I think for me, a really good starting point is, of course, recognizing that the internet is an exciting place. And of course, many of you will remember the time when there was no internet and the transformation it's made. And if you can't remember it, I'll show no bitterness towards your youth. But you know, from fast food to fast music, it's been the doorway to opportunity and luxury. And in its current design, it's a free forum for information of all kinds. And really, it's leveled the playing field for access to knowledge like no other time in our history. And I'm a firm believer that this should be protected, and our right to freedom of speech and indeed the right to be offended are crucial liberties in our society. And we've also seen the importance of the internet over the past few months throughout the pandemic. It's kept families connected. Businesses have been able to adopt new worlds of e-commerce. And of course, a significant proportion of our social interactions have now moved online. But clearly, online hate and online harm go beyond these aforementioned liberties, because we've also seen that in the wrong hands, the internet can be weaponized. And we can see this in a number of instances. We've seen this in terms of right-wing attacks, you know, the Christchurch attack in 2019, where the attacker put his had a lot of presence online, but also put his manifesto online. It also spurred on you know, copycat attacks in synagogues and in other places where the attackers actually referred to that online reference of the manifesto being there. And so we can see the roots of radicalization can be found in online in the online world. And I think the point I'm really trying to make here is that there is a causal link between the online world and the offline world, and we absolutely have to recognize that. And of course, at the start of the introduction, we heard about the rise in anti-Semitism online and the impact that has. Look, from a personal experience, you know, Victoria spoke about being a woman politician. Well, you know, I'm a politician in the public sphere as a Muslim, and the online world does present an opportunity for those who would like to express some of their abhorrent views. You know, sometimes it's in the form of racism, sometimes it's in the form of my faith, and it can come from those in the far right world, or those who just don't think that I conform to their idea of what a British Muslim should certainly think about. But I like the Minister, I have to be honest. I've probably not had it as bad as some of my colleagues, and probably not had it as bad as some of my Jewish colleagues, which I do see. And I certainly know when I do see it, I do report it online. Sometimes I'll get a report back from the social media companies many weeks later saying we've looked at your report, and by that time, even I've forgotten what the issue was per se. And obviously, social media companies are really going to have to pull up their socks in this sphere and try and be much more responsive. But for me, I really draw my strength and motivation on this issue from a personal experience, which I had a few years ago when I engaged in an interfaith project. And I actually visited a synagogue in Birmingham. And I found it astonishing, the level of security that was required when you go to pray. And I just remember thinking how scary it must be for a child going to pray and having to go through these different aspects of security, and for a parent to try and explain that to a child must be completely well, I just couldn't fathom it, to be honest. And certainly I'm very driven in this issue because I want to play my part in building a role where certainly my children don't have to worry about security measures when it goes to work and going to worship. When I don't want my children going online and seeing harmful content. I don't mind debating issues. I don't mind intellectual debates, of course, and society as a whole will have to decide where the line for that will be. But actually, what there is quite clearly, we need to be able to recognise that there are online harms, and that will certainly that translates into the offline world. And certainly, so I'm very much driven by the idea that where social media companies have allowed anti-Semitism to thrive, certainly we now need to, dare I say it, take back a bit of control and try and put a framework in place where social media companies take responsibility. They are of course driven by the need to have people online and spend as much time online, but surely our children and our future generations deserve to do that in a safe manner with respect. And certainly in a way that has respect for other people's views and the other people to allow to practice their religion freely. So I see the connection between the online world and the offline world very much go hand in hand. And I completely agree with what Victoria said, and of course what Robert said there, because there's some really important issues that I'm sure we'll unpack throughout the panel.
Thank you very much for that. And of course, your point about the impact on children is really very much a key one for us all. And I would now like to turn to Lord Popat, who's patiently waited to make some opening remarks. And I hope, Lord Popat, you'll make some reference to the fact that you've written about how you've seen hate speech and news directly leading to violence. So Lord Popat, a few minutes from you, please.
Thank you, Gillian. In fact, thank you for allowing me to express my views on this subject, which I take it very seriously. In fact, as you know, I came as a refugee in this country when I was young at 17, and I faced prejudice, and I know what it is like to go through this hate by other people, or by other media and other people. So I'm glad I'm taking part. In fact, what I did in 2018, when I saw this anti-Semitism was just boiling up for years, and no parliamentarians were, talking about it or discussing openly in Parliament. I'm glad Robert did in the Commons and I did in the Lords. And I started my speech by saying, why me? Why have I taken upon myself to bring this debate into your Lordship's house? After all, I'm not Jewish, but I felt that by being quiet or being silent, you will encourage lies to become truth, and fake news to become sort of true as well. And when you face intolerance, we encourage prejudice. So I brought this debate up, and we, as a British Indian community, we have faced prejudice in our own ways. We have faced hatred and in the social media, and quite a bit has been written. But what I was shocked when I did research on this debate, I looked at the social media. And when you look up Israel on social media, and you'll be shocked to see the level of hate directed against Jews. Phrases such as Zionists controlling the media, financial institutions, our foreign policy, and so forth. And this has to stop. In fact, Marie quite rightly said that in 2020, there were 44% of total hate speech or misinformation or fake news were directed toward the Jewish community. And in my article, Facebook deleted a record number of hate speech posts, with 9.6 million taken down the first quarter of this year. So I'm glad something is happening, but we need to do more on this subject as quickly as possible. So I'm in support of the three principles that's been laid down by British Board of Jewish Deputies. And I think something we must expedite as quickly as we can, because I've experienced prejudice myself. In fact, I'll outline that in my book when I came as a refugee in this country. And we British Indians had a special affiliation with the Jewish community. So anti-Semitism concerns the whole community, and they were fully supportive of working with the Jewish community to remove this hate, to remove this fake news and misinformation about people and communities. The commonality we have of hard work, education, enterprise, family, faith, and all that, when we work together, we quite often, because we are successful, there's more hate towards us. In fact, when I did this debate in the House of Lords, I got quite a few WhatsApp and emails hating me for doing it, which is something we should not tolerate at all. I recall as a 17-year-old kid, when we go back to Uganda with that brutal dictator, the first thing he did was to expel the Jewish community. Within few months, it was us. So today it's Jewish, tomorrow it could be us. And something, this country that we live in, an amazing country, very tolerant country that we live in, a country that's given us so much, and we have given so much to the country in return as well, that we should live peacefully, and further and firm action should be taken with publishers and other social media channels to stop this hate crime, to stop giving this misinformation and fake news about communities and people. But equally, Gillian, we need to also work within the communities that there's also hatred from one community to another community. And that we should work to stop that happening as well. I'll stop there. Thank you, Gillian.
Thank you very much, Lord Popat. And I am very grateful to you all for opening up for the panel. And I'm going to want to turn first to Victoria, who I know has to leave us shortly, to talk specifically about what actually needs to be done. And just a very quick recap, Marie made the point that there are three main things that we believe from the Board of Deputies are essential to confronting online hate. First of all, appointing that any regulator that's appointed to oversee the companies actually make sure that there is an adoption of the IRA definition. That secondly, that social media companies will appoint a UK moderating team to look at UK users. And the reason for that is, of course, that in-country teams are much more able to do the job than those that are not in country. And thirdly, that we should see the adoption of the German model of a heavy system of fines for social media companies who fail to comply. So firstly, Victoria, I turn to you and I will come to the rest of the panelists. But Victoria, we're looking for confirmation of support for those three areas, but also to say, what else do you think that there is that's needed?
Well, thank you so much, Gillian, and my apologies in advance because I've got another fringe event
we understand.
to go to. So on the IRA point, I mean, first of all, I should say that the government gave an interim, if you like, response to the consultation that we had launched on the online harms white paper. We have promised to give a full response to the consultation in the autumn. And this consultation, just to put it in context, we got more than 2,300 responses from all sorts of organisations as well as members of the general public. So we've taken time to go through those responses very carefully. And so you'll have to forgive me if I am careful as to what I say at this session, just because, of course, I wouldn't want to preempt the publication of the full response. But just as a matter of common sense, we the UK government adopted the IRA definition in 2016, as did the Conservative Party, and so I would imagine that any independent regulator will look very, very carefully at that definition. But as I say, forgive me if I can't go into more detail ahead of the full response. In terms of the moderating teams in the UK, I think that's a very, very fair point. And I would argue, actually, it should be something that social media companies are doing at this moment without government regulation or requirement, because as you say, having a team of people who are who live in our country, who understand some of the slang or the unpleasant words used to refer to people or groups of people, seems to me that would just make good business sense to help them make their decisions better and in a responsible way. And then in terms of the German model, again, I'm so sorry, I'm going to have to wait for the full response, but we have looked, the government has looked around the world to see what other countries are doing and what is working and what is not working. And we have also listened very, very carefully, as I say, to the consultation responses. So I do emphasize again, though, we are very much intending to introduce this duty of care, and the regulator, the independent regulator, will be responsible for ensuring that companies meet their responsibilities under that duty of care. That's really quite groundbreaking. Now, in terms of what more we can do, I very much echo Robert's points about making sure that we as a community are doing the right thing, and making sure that our children are learning the right lessons and not becoming victims themselves of hatred online, but also making it clear what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. I zoomed in very recently to a meeting held by Barnardo's with a group of young people, a slightly different subject matter, but of course we were on Zoom, so we talked about the online sphere. And I think it's as much about teaching our young people resilience. Just because someone DMs you doesn't mean that you have to respond to them or indeed open the message. You can have that confidence of knowing that you should only be speaking to people that you know or that you're comfortable with. And so those sorts of lessons are very much being taught as part of the national curriculum now, as part of relationships education and so on. And I think Rob's absolutely right. That's the key to tackling some of these attitudes and making sure that in 10 years' time we're not having to have conference events about online hate, because actually we as a society have managed it, and social media companies have stepped up to the mark as well in terms of their responsibilities.
Thank you, Victoria. And yes, let us hope indeed that we will soon find that having to have such discussions, panels, actions and legislation indeed will be redundant. But I think we're a little way off from that. But we wish you well in all of your endeavours. I know that you do have to leave us, but thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed being here. Thank you.
Pleasure to have you. If I could now turn to Rob to ask you, Rob, if you could let us know, could you get behind the 3 things that we're looking for from the Board of Deputies, and what else do you think needs to be done?
Well, absolutely. Of course, I support the measures set out by the Board of Deputies. It's common sense. But as I reiterated in my remarks, my opening remarks, I do think there are challenges. As I said about moderation, I don't want it to be hijacked by people who have an agenda either against the state of Israel or certain aspects of the Jewish community. And we know that those kind of things that have happened in the past Absolutely, the Holocaust definitions need to be adopted. But it's not just a question of adopting these guidelines, it's a question of taking action and making sure that they are happening. I think Saqib made a very good point in his remarks that when you do, it's always incredible to me that the onus is on the victim to go through all the aggro when they're racially abused on Twitter, and then you're lucky if you do get a response, or as Saqib said, you get it weeks later, and then nothing happens because the individual is on the internet again, either with the same account or he or she has just set up a new account. And that's why I'm absolutely clear that I think this anonymized, I don't mind people having an anonymous or funny name for an account that you don't know who they are, but when they register with social media companies, they should have to put their name, have to put their address, so their proper emails and so on, so that if there is any abuse, that it's easy to track them down and take action. But most importantly, the laws have to be changed to deal with this. Really tough laws on defamatory behavior and online hate, and as Victoria ended, the education of our children, so we stop this for the next generation.
Thank you very much, and for addressing, Rob, also the kind of how to try to stop us being in this position. It's very important that we just don't deal with the difficulties presented. So I appreciate your thoughtfulness on that. And with that, I'd like to turn to Saqib to ask about getting behind the Board of Deputies' 3 main points, and also anything else that you think needs to be done to tackle online harm and abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm absolutely behind all 3 recommendations, actually. I mean, starting with the IRA, I mean, we have a strong working definition here, and I'd just say this really, and you take it as a shot across the bow to the social media companies if they are watching. The fact of the matter is, if they don't do it, the direction of travel is in that way, and that they will having a duty of care is going to be so important. And if they don't do it, I mean, I think there's an inevitability to this. So it's absolutely correct that the IRA definition should be adopted. By the way, not just by social media companies. I'm also put in to speak in the Westminster Hall debate for universities to adopt this as well, because having a framework, and the definition does allow for that framework to be to exist. It doesn't mean we're inhibiting free speech, but what it does mean, we're stopping the world of free speech being corrupted by those who seek to divide us, and that's why this is really, really important that we have the IRA definition adopted as well. And of course, having a UK team makes complete sense. Because there will be, mannerisms, languages, jokes, etc., that only a UK team may understand, and that's absolutely right to do. And of course, if the social media companies don't respond properly, if we are going to set this ambition that in 10 years' time we're not going to be dealing with conversation around online hate, because we've got a good framework in place, and some sort of sanctions will be inevitable. But one thing I would like to see as well is, if social media companies are serious about doing this, they should look also at their algorithms to make sure that where there is harmful content, if it's in that kind of area, and take personal responsibility for this and adjust that algorithm to make sure that harmful content is harder to find in that time where they're moderating, or whatever period is in place. So at least, so I talked about children earlier, but generally the public aren't able to see that information. It's just really, really hard to find. They should, at the very minimum, they should be doing that, in my personal view. And I certainly hope that they move in that direction. So I guess my answer to this question is personal responsibility is going to be very important, not just for the individual, like Robert just spoke about. I think that's a very sensible measure, but also for those social media companies to take on, have that personal responsibility. Otherwise, all that will happen is this debate will go on, and we will ask for more sanctions.
Gillian, can I just say one quick thing?
Of course.
I forgot to mention that when you report racism or anti-Semitism, whatever it is, you have to do usually a complicated email trail or report it via Twitter. I actually think that Twitter should have, and social media companies should have, a helpline that deals with abuse. that you ring up a individual, you report the abuse, that a human will then contact you and take and set out the action that they will then take, so that people can be reassured that it's going to be properly dealt with.
And thank you for that, Rob. It's a very good point. It's very important that it shouldn't be difficult to report, let alone difficult to get a response. And Saqib, you were mentioning, I wonder if the social media companies are watching. I think we can pretty much count on it that they are. So I hope they've heard what you have to say. And Rob, I do know that you have to leave us shortly.
Yes.
So when you do, thank you very much for being here with us, and we really appreciate it and wish you all strength in what you're doing.
Thank you, and good luck, everybody, and well done to the other panelists. Thank you.
And with that, I shall turn to Lord Popat to see if, Lord Popat, can we count on your support also for the three main things that the Board of Deputies is looking for, and also your thoughts on what more can be done?
Yes, in fact, I'm fully supporting the three principles outlined by the Board of Jewish Deputies. But as you know, fake news, hate, all that on WhatsApp is perhaps the bigger problem to solve, given that we have more than about 30 million users just in the United Kingdom. So there is certainly no quick fix to this problem. If social media platforms attempted to monitor private messages, this would be a step towards mass surveillance and be rejected by the platform users. There must be a reconciliation between free expression and discrimination. And quite rightly, in fact, what Robert just mentioned, having a helpline and other ways of stopping this happening is very, very important. But regulation of some sort is inevitable. And I think hopefully that the parliamentarians will listen to this and take the right action and speed up the process, because the number of hate speech is coming to people, to communities, in particular the Jewish community as a whole, is just too many for us to tolerate.
I think that's quite right, and a very good point to make, and leads us quite well on to, I have a question in from Joan Edwards. I'm just going to, Joan, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to slightly amend the kind of the theme, simply because our panelists have addressed the main point, but the question is about education, and I know both of you have touched on this, but I wonder if we could explore a bit more about what role education has in defeating online harms, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, it's so important to look at why it comes about, not just dealing with the outcome. So, Saqib, if I can turn to you first.
Absolutely. I mean, a friend of mine recently said to me, you know, children aren't born racist. And I think that's as simplistic as that is, I think it's very, very important to recognize the role that education will have in this. And that you may have noticed from my introduction, I place a lot of faith on the future generations. I'm very optimistic about where we will move as a society. And quite clearly, we should make sure that our kids are educated. I saw I don't want to misquote, but I saw a statistic about I think it was in the United States about the amount of people who don't know about the Holocaust. And quite frankly, we need to make sure that our children remember that or are taught about these events that happened, where otherwise we risk history repeating itself. And as we've seen from I mentioned the Christchurch attack, and then it spawned off other attacks into synagogues, etc. Clearly, the people who have these who conduct these attacks, they don't put it, one community can just be transferred to another one, and their hate actually has no specificity. So frankly, I think education, and Robert obviously talks about this, is going to be so crucial, because actually helping our future generations mold their knowledge and mold them in a way that they can be forward thinking and welcoming and tolerant I mean, they could achieve things, in a much better way than we probably will in the next 10 years. And we should see that as an opportunity. And education is absolutely crucial. And I think Lord Popat talked about inter-community discrimination as well. I think that comes into this as well, really, which is why I'm very proud to be on this panel. And I think it's really important that the Board of Deputies is leading the charge on this, because I think it will help. It will help British society as a whole, and we will probably feel the positive effects of this for many generations to come. So I think education is absolutely at the heart of it. We absolutely should be understanding what's happened in the past to make sure we don't repeat those mistakes, and also make sure that our children have the tools and the resilience we spoke about to be able to deal with this, and actually call it out on the online world, which I don't see enough, actually, if I'm honest with you. And we all have a responsibility to do that.
Really good point on resilience and calling it out, and we all need to remember, and you can certainly be assured from the Board of Deputies will continue that, particularly if we have your support, and as I know we do. Lord Popat, the final word to you on education and what role it can play.
I think Saqib put it so well. It's important we educate people. I'll give you a recent example. I had some hate things about Rishi Sunak, and it kept passing on from one person to another. When it came to me, I sent it to this guy who sent it to me. So can you stop sending this out? This is not true. So we must all contribute to tackling the issue. We must ask ourselves whether something we read is true. And we must question the article, videos we are sent. If we see the hate post about violence, we should report it. If you receive forwarded post on WhatsApp, we must think twice before forwarding to other people. So this sort of education is key. Not so we stop spreading this lies and hate and fake news and all that. So I think we ourselves, apart from legislation that we can bring in, I think we must give education to people that if you see something which comes on your social media or email or WhatsApp, don't forward it. And whoever is forwarded, make sure you stop them doing it, or probably have a go at them. This is not true.
Yes, that's a good thing to be reminding us of, and it is on that theme of calling out and acting. And I would like to draw the panel to a close by thanking you all. It's been a pleasure to chair the panel. And as we heard earlier, I hope one day we won't have to have panels on subjects such as this. And in closing, I'm going to pass over to Amanda Bowman, who's Vice President of the Board of Deputies and Chair of our Defence Division, who will give the final words. But from me, thank you. So over to Amanda.
Thanks, Gillian. And thank you so much to our panellists. One thing that came across to me in particular, and I'm sure this is something that struck others as well, is how ubiquitous online hate now seems. It feels like it's become part of an accepted part of everyday life, that if you're a woman or from a minority ethnic or religious community or LGBT+, that you'll inevitably receive online abuse. And that shouldn't be the case. We shouldn't just accept that things are this way and will continue to be this way. The British Jewish community is well aware of the growing problem with online hate in terms of the increased anti-Semitism. But as today has made extremely clear, this is not just a problem being faced by the Jewish community, it's a problem facing all of us in society. People whose sole objective appears to be to sow hate and division are being allowed to operate with impunity online. And unfortunately, the response by the various social media companies has been lethargic at best and obstructive at worst. As Marie mentioned in her introduction, it was the Conservative government in 2016 that led the way in the adoption of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. With the forthcoming online harms bill, the government again has the opportunity to lead the way in passing legislation that acknowledges the difference between free speech and hate speech and ensures that social media companies are held properly responsible for the proliferation of the latter on their platforms. We're confident that the government will not let this opportunity pass it by. The Jewish community is currently celebrating the festival of Sukkot, also known as Tabernacles. Traditionally, during Sukkot, Jews recite the book of Ecclesiastes, which in its 3rd chapter contains the famous refrain that there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. One of the verses in that passage goes on to say that there is a time for silence and a time to speak. On this issue, we believe that the time for silence is long past. It's the duty of all of us to speak out on this subject and to make it clear that we are no longer prepared to accept the status quo. Thank you all.